It seems that everybody in Vietnam is striving to get ahead, spending on education, traveling overseas, doing whatever. Whereas it would appear in India, I don't know whether there's a bulk of people that have kind of given up hope. Really interesting to hear this chat saying, well, you know what? There are handouts coming. Life's kind of improving. Do I really want to go and work hard? Do I want to travel away from home? And maybe part of that is actually if the factories do start moving into inner India and people see they can work in air conditioning and stuff like that. It's certainly not the FDI paradise that some people, I think, were kind of selling.
Welcome to the New Asia podcast by Muddy Waters Asia. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters New World Order Fund, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more.
Hi, welcome to the third edition of the New Asia podcast. I'm Carson Block of Muddy Waters Capital, and I'm joined by our head of Asia, Rob Med. Rob, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Carson. It's nice to be here in Austin. A bit of warm weather. Mind you, having come from India, it was pretty warm when we were there, but it's a lot more blue sky and a lot less pollution here.
Yeah, but I was going to actually bring up the allusion to India's weather, so you beat me to the punch. But I think it's time this episode that we talk India. So there's a lot of work that we've done in the past several months, and you've been going to India and looking at investments there since 2003. You are based in Vietnam presently. What are your thoughts on setting up a fund management business in India versus what we've been doing in Vietnam?
Well, I think it's a really exciting prospect. There's a couple of things. It's fascinating having been back to India after sort of 5 years where I hadn't been away. There's a lot's changed. Modi has put a lot of money into infrastructure. It was really nice. We were in both Mumbai and Delhi. It's really nice to be in Mumbai and actually be able to drive along the new coastal road, which sort of zips you along. So that's great. India is interesting because it's just so much bigger than Vietnam. But weirdly, it's got this strange population distribution where the population is 1.4 billion, obviously a lot bigger than Vietnam, but the average GDP is about half of that of Vietnam.
I mean,
However,
their per capita GDP.
yeah, let's clarify. It'd be really, really bad news if it was half of Vietnam's GDP for the whole country. Yeah, so, but when you go there, you can see a lot of wealth, but you also get to see a lot of poverty, whereas Vietnam's much more in that sort of averagey band where there is clearly wealth. Our old office, I don't know whether you saw, was opposite the McLaren showroom. I don't know how many McLarens they were selling to Vietnam, but I presume there was some bid for those things. So, a very interesting contrast, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to say, one of the things that surprised me of the trips that I've made to India this year, really just to Mumbai. So I know that, what I saw is not the real India, but as you mentioned, the infrastructure, the coastal road, and I had expected traffic to just be miserable the entire time there. And if you drive in eastward, then yeah, that's when the roads can get really jammed up. But there's a pretty clear, nice expressway from the airport all the way into the city. There's significant bridge that you go over, and then that coastal road. It's an underpass that goes under the bay to Marine Drive. I mean, it's really, yeah, and apparently none of this was there just a few years ago.
Yeah, and look, it is an improvement, but you do have to come back to a little bit of that sort of Soviet mentality. I remember being in the Ukraine, and the road to the premier's house in those days was immaculate. You went 2 yards beyond the president's house, and the road fell apart. You missed the time in Delhi. Obviously, as you know, we went on to Delhi afterwards. We spent an awful lot of time in traffic jams there. And again, there's, it's similar in a funny way to Vietnam. It's very easy to be a fly-by investor. You turn up, go and stay in there's some beautiful hotels in India. You go and stay in a beautiful hotel, you have a nice road, they turn up with a shiny Mercedes, you zoom along, everyone speaks English, the food's great. bit fattening, to be honest, in India, but
Yeah.
some problems. And you think, wow, this is really, really modern and different. Then you start going and visiting the factories, and you're going down pothole roads, and you're getting into serious traffic jams. So we'll get you into Delhi, and we'll get you into the countryside next time, and you'll get to see a little bit more of a full-fledged approach. And that's actually weirdly one of the things I think where Vietnam is actually ahead of India, in that I think that the general quality of roads in Vietnam, and I'm talking a broad average, is actually better than in India. However, as we're about to discuss, I think, with other things, the extremes in India are much more extreme. You know, where it's good, it's amazing. Where it's rubbish, it's really crap.
Well, before we get to comparison of daily life, what about the market? And obviously, our business is fund management. That's why we set up shop in Vietnam. We're long Vietnam equities. We want to be long Indian equities. So, what's the opportunity set there in India like compared to Vietnam?
Huge. I mean, in the same way, obviously the population is a lot bigger, therefore you're just gonna be doing more business. You know, there are 1,300 companies over $100 million in India. There are far fewer than that in Vietnam. Even when I looked at some statistics, it's 10 billion, sorry, 10, not 10 billion. There are 10 companies over $10 billion. I think no, over $100 billion. So whereas there's nothing in Vietnam, and just that whole advantage of scale, it's a funny but different comparison. You think of England and America, and yeah, you can do well in England because it's a reasonably rich economy, but nothing like how well you can do in the States, just because you've got the scale of people. In the same way, the rich in India are global standard rich, whereas the rich in Vietnam are, by your my standards, pretty damn rich, but nowhere like they are in India. You know, you go to Mumbai and you see the Ambani Tower, and I suspect that wouldn't be allowed in Vietnam. But I mean, personally, I think it's a little bit tasteless because it's right in the middle of a bunch of slums. It's certainly not the sort of English, slightly back foot about wealth approach. But hey, things are different in India. It's their culture, their country. But yeah, going back to the market, I think there's lots of opportunity. When to see a few companies, we're going to be seeing a lot more over the next year. As you know, our sort of process of get the data on every company available, distill it down, then start to see people. We met a couple of people. Well, you were in the one meeting with some really interesting brokers who've offered to help us, which is very kind. Sure, a fee will be charged at some stage, but you know, fair enough. And I think there are quite a lot of undiscovered, really interesting companies.
When I first thought about investing in India many years ago, somebody said to me at the time, so we're talking 2012, they said, India makes China look like Switzerland. And I don't get the impression that's still the case. I mean, that's not to say that this is a developed market and, and things are the way they should be, but my impression is that the level of corruption in companies and the lying in their financial statements is a decent bit lower than it had been. And you've been looking at Indian companies for a couple of decades. Do I perceive this correctly? And if so, to what would you attribute the changes?
Well, I'm glad you clarified the Switzerland comparison. I was wondering whether it was a place to stash German gold, or somewhere that made chocolate. They do make quite good chocolate in India, not quite as good as Vietnam. I have to express my personal bias, but yeah, look, I think, it's funny when we think about China. A lot of the egregious frauds were listed in the US because it wasn't a crime to nick money off Americans. I don't think it's a crime now. Whereas it is a crime for Chinese people to nick money off other Chinese people. The difference, so there's one big difference where in India, very, very few companies are actually listed overseas. It's I believe it might even be illegal to list overseas. It's a few GDRs, but so there's less room for that sort of Nasdaq pump and dump rubbish, which is quite good news. There is, however, a fairly strong founder ownership approach. I'm not sure I love or despise the idea that they call people everybody involved in managing and doing whatever a stock in India promoters. I mean, it sort of says itself. Yes, and they're
That
going, we're
that
here to
threw me
promote it and pump the bubble.
that threw me for a loop the first time when they're saying, "Oh, you want to look for the really good promoters." Like, man,
Yeah.
are you
I
saying the quiet part out loud here? Like,
Yeah, and
that threw me for a
you
loop.
know when is people like Chamath going to come and visit in India so they can pump and dump? But yeah, I mean, getting back to sort of slightly more serious note. So I mean, there are people who very much are involved, family-run companies. They are reasonably conservative. The accounting is interesting. It's a sort of uh, I wouldn't say bastardized version of IFRS accounting, but it kind of is. Um, and we had an interesting starter meeting with one of the accountants going, look, can you please take us through the way that Indians fiddle their accounts? Because every country tends to have their own quirks. In contrast to Vietnam, where everybody tries to over depreciate to reduce their tax bill, they don't seem to be doing that in India. But there are other things. The whole consolidated accounting is fraught with fraught with opportunity, shall we say, depending on when you want to be. So I think there is. I think that's where somewhat our sort of value slash growth comes in, because we're traditionally, I mean, I'm not going to be trying to sell you on some internet startup, $50 billion valuation, and no one understands the business. So we kind of miss out on that. And at the other end of the extreme, obviously, we want to go to see people who've got factories, got businesses. That helps out. I mean, I did go, so I have to bring this up because when we start talking about barriers to entry, I did see a very ingenious condom manufacturer there, who I think is doing quite a good job, but the valuation is eye-watering. There's no sort of no way to grease the pain of that one. But I think that's where we sit there and go, look, we're going to come across some businesses, some of which we think are great businesses. We've just got to wait for the opportunity, the valuation to come our way. And others where we turn around and go, look, this is growing and the valuation is reasonable. One of the advantages of being in and out of Vietnam over such a long period is that I've seen Indian enthusiasms in the past. You look at stuff and go, oh my God, it's a great company, but it's hideously expensive. And as we know, emerging markets, there's expensive times and there's cheap times. But the great thing, whereas in Vietnam you're slightly constrained because it's a relatively small pool. So if you want to be invested, you got to be invested. The great thing about India is it's a big enough market. You can go in the places that are looking attractive, and then go in a different place when they're having an over the top run.
We have our Vietnam book. We've had that for a couple of years. It's very industrial, and we publicly stated that we own High-End Transport, which is an inland container shipping, or not inland, but it's coastal water container shipping company, and inland waterway container shipping company.
Which, sorry, just to
it-
cut in that, which is an interesting moment on there, because it looks as if we might be having one of our first hostile M&As in
that's
Vietnam, which
that's
really
true.
interesting company. Anyway,
Yeah,
sorry,
no, that
back to
that'll
you.
be yeah, that'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
Hostile takeover attempt there. Um, been public on Viettel Construction, which is shifting its business into tower ownership and operation, but it's generally a pretty industrial book. And as we've often said, that with Vietnam, we're backing some of the country's best entrepreneurs because the exception of, say, Viettel Construction and some of the banks, these companies are generally run by their controlling shareholders. So he's a founder, or son or daughter of the founder. What do you think it's going to look like in India, both in terms of the composition, from sector basis? I think we're going to be decent bit less industrial, but What do you think that's going to look like? And then also, do we see the same levels of entrepreneurship among these managements, or are these more professional or are more of these managements professionals where they were hired and from the outside?
I think, I mean, we're going to be ultimately, there's, I suspect, going to be a bigger sort of servicey type tilt to the portfolio, simply because, if you look at a industry composition of what's happening in India, there's much more of that. There's much lower real estate. And obviously the service side has really grown. One of the things I haven't thought about is one of the reasons why the service side has grown so fast in India is because it came about after Modi got into power. And the Indians have learned quite a lot from the EU about regulation. The more you can pile on, the better, regulate industry to death. But that was done under the Congress party and prior to Modi coming to power. So all the regulation they would have liked to have installed just hasn't happened in the service sector. So the service sector has grown really fast because this happened under Modi's time. And I think, look, I'm fairly sure, going to be looking at some of that. I went to see a really interesting hospital. They're doing some good things. Now, hospitals are an interesting sector when we talk about, I don't know whether you describe it as fraud or corruption, but there's a lot of payments that get circulated around. They learn from the American medical fraternity as to how to make sure that people are encouraged to do things to extract the maximum amount of cash out of people who are sick. But some of them are running both high quality businesses and in a sort of honest and fiduciary kind of way. So yeah, but and that sector, for example, doesn't exist in Vietnam at some or some not on the listed side. So I think it's going to be a uh, different by industry makeup portfolio, but it's going to be very similar by um, sort of ethics, what sort of management we think are doing interesting stuff and driving the business forward, people who are incentivized, and that's not in a sort of, share-based compensation kind of incentivization rip-off version like you get in the States, but people are incentivized to do well for the business and do well for minorities. So there's really big overlaps and also some differences.
How do the growth rates, top line, bottom line growth rates between companies in India, that you think are within our investable universe and the companies in Vietnam, how do those compare?
Quite similar. I think the big difference ultimately between India and Vietnam is the export sector is so important to Vietnam. And so when exports are running, it does help lift the domestic economy. Whereas exports are interesting. I mean, I think they're about, if you just took gross exports, they compare to about 20% of GDP in India, whereas it's 60% in Vietnam. So obviously there's a big difference there. So India kind of trundles along with its own domestic growth story. Ultimately, I still think we can look at both countries and see compound growth rates on the top line over time. Not every year, there'll be fluctuations, 15 to 20%. There's a long way to go. I mean, even just very simplistically, you turn around and go, GDP per capita, as I say, is half of Vietnam's in India. I mean, it's quite stunning, really. Now, there's wide dispersion. So you go to some of the city states, it's sort of like $7,000. You go to some of the poor states, it's under $1,000. But as the whole place, I mean, I remember when China built the big gas pipeline, everyone's like, what on earth are you doing building this gas pipeline across the middle of China? And what the Chinese were doing quite sensibly was like, well, if we build a gas pipeline across the middle, we can then put in junction points, a bit like when the Americans were building railroads, and you put a tap in, and then all of a sudden everybody starts building a town around that tap, building industries, and it all happens. Whereas, of course, if you've just got a man and a doggy cart, nothing moves and nothing gets developed. Now, by India putting in all these roads and building the infrastructure, and it's still happening, and I think Modi's doing a lot of good there, you will start to see areas opening up that will mean drive the growth is self-perpetuating.
Right. Well, it enables you to marshal resources. So, which is obviously how China developed in its early days by building that infrastructure to enable to do that. Vietnam as well. Um, what do you touched on this a moment ago, but you're talking about the regulatory sy- system in or the regulatory state in India and how the service sector really escaped that.
Yeah, there's one caveat in that. Unfortunately, the stock market was around for quite a long time before Modi got in, so there's plenty of regulation there.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the things that as a fund manager, an American fund manager setting up in India, there's a decent amount of facets of setting up an Indian fund management entity that are pretty difficult and unique from the American side. But I guess one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we were in India was how you brought up this point that politically Vietnam is communist and India is capitalist, but economically, Vietnam, you'd call it capitalist, so communist but capitalist, whereas India is democracy, but it's actually kind of socialist.
Well, yeah, and when you dig into a bit of that, because you sort of see that at the major level, then you dig into that and you go, oh, look, when you look at tax rates, now personal tax rates look roughly similar, but when you look at how much the government relies on tax individuals, it's much higher in India. And when you look, and there's no capital gains. So actually, as a Vietnamese entrepreneur, you can do very well and make a load of money and get rich. If you're an overseas investor in Vietnam, you don't pay tax on any gains, hoping you make some. In India, they have got their hands in your pocket, whatever you do. They're taxing the locals on capital gains, they're taxing the foreigners on capital gains. The government spending is about 34% of GDP, whereas in Vietnam it's under 20%. So the government is well and truly entrenched in everybody's business. In India, in contrast to Vietnam.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that was interesting because when we talk about India, 1.4 billion people, demographic dividend based on distribution of their population right now by age. But we did hear people saying that, that labor, manufacturing labor or unskilled, low skilled labor is actually not as easy to come by as people think. And that's people we talked to blamed that in part on the government's generous subsidies for subsistence farmers or people not who live in the countryside who aren't really doing anything. And they made the point that if you're Indian, like, you're going to be fed. Like you don't have to work in order to make sure that there's food on your table. And that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I think part of that, and I've lived in Asia quite a long time, so this isn't a sort of racial slur or anything, but the Chinese and that sort of the Chinese diaspora, they are smart and ambitious. And even if they're having a reasonably nice life, they will still work hard and study hard because they really, really want to get ahead. And particularly the Chinese historically, because the perceived injustices and stuff like that. Whereas you get the impression that, there's clearly the sort of well-educated Indians and those ambitions, really ambitious one, and maybe it's a religious thing that there is there in the Indian culture that, you know what, if life's okay, life's okay. And you may not, by Western standards, have all sorts of stuff, but it seems that everybody in Vietnam is striving to get ahead. Uh, Spending on education, traveling overseas, doing whatever. Whereas it would appear in India, I don't know whether there's a bulk of people that have kind of given up hope, but as you say, really interesting to hear this chat saying, well, you know what? There are handouts coming. Life's kind of improving. Do I really want to go and work hard? Do I want to travel away from home? And maybe part of that is actually if the factories do start moving into inner India and people see they can work in air conditioning and stuff like that, it will improve. But it's certainly not the FDI paradise that some people, I think, were kind of selling. And particularly because when you sit there and go, look, FDI is so important to Vietnam, and people turn around and go, no, well, everyone will just go manufacture in India because it's bigger and it's cooler and the lower tariffs. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, but you got hideous labor laws. There's tax on everything. Infrastructure is improving, but it's not there yet. I see was just again going through the tax. So if you are Indian domestic company, you pay 30% tax. If you are a foreigner, you pay 40% tax. Now it's kind of the other way around in Vietnam. If you're an FDI and you come in with a big enough wad of cash, they will come up with some structure that means that you actually pay low tax. And of course, corporate tax in Vietnam is only 30%. Sorry, it's only 20% anyway. So you get a reduction on that. So, I think, look, there is growth, there is scale. Went to see somebody manufacturing what you'd kind of describe as Tupperware and plastic bowls and stuff like that. Really interesting business. You'd think that was totally mundane in America because everyone's got that sort of stuff. No, they're seeing as people move up their income and they literally go from not quite eating off the floor but onto a table, they need crockery. And so he's seeing demand. It's a very competitive business. And I don't think it's an investment that we would look at, but they're seeing literal, increasing quantity demand about 20% compound every year as more and more people need that stuff. So, the domestic demand story is very much still there, very much moving ahead. Look, I think the FDI will come, but I don't think it's quite the sort of exciting freebie that some people were selling.
Right. Another thing that I found was pretty interesting, and I guess goes to the socialist mindset of India, is the civil service. So when speaking with people who are well educated and high earners, they talk about this stereotype of the Indian civil service worker they have, Babu. Babu is a fat, lazy, entitled civil service worker. If your scooter gets towed or whatever, picked up because it's parked illegally, Babu will tell you, well, fill out these forms and go to a bunch of different places, and in 6 months you can get your scooter back. But then if you offer him some money, he'll say, okay, yeah, it's around back, go get it now. And it was interesting because the impression that I got is that while your upper crust of society hates like Babu and really thinks that the civil service is far too bloated, that for a lot of society that represents like the embodiment of the Indian dream, where you get that job, it's your job for lifetime. Your kids and probably their kids are going to be able to join the civil service in a similar, or if not the same job. You're well paid relative to the rest of India. Then of course you get to extract money through, Babu-like behaviors and threats of inaction. And yeah, it's got the impression I got is that even if the BJP, which is Modi's party, controlled all the state governments as well as the federal government, you couldn't get rid of the civil service, or you couldn't not get rid of course not, but you couldn't sharply reduce the bloat of the civil service and rein in their ability to extract rents dramatically, because that is kind of like the embodiment of the Indian dream for a lot of people.
Yeah, unfortunately, there were some bad things left behind by the English, and that sort of dream to work in the civil service, which is still alive and kicking in the UK, is certainly something. Yeah, there is no Department of Doge in India, and there's no likelihood of that happening. And again, one of the interesting contrasts, and something we're going to have to really dig into, is the Indian system is much more like the States in the sense of you've got the sort of central government, and people talk about Modi as
Mhm.
being the man in charge, but actually the states are incredibly important. And even when you look at tax revenues and stuff like that, the center raises some taxes, but the states raise their own taxes. Then the central government sends some money, about 45% of the money goes from the central government, gets sent back out to the states. And each state has its own parliament. And I mean, it's quite shocking, the disparity between the different states, because you've got some who are still full-on headbanging communists. You've got some who are dynamic and trying to grow, and I think India is slowly moving, because unlike China, you can live wherever you want to live in India. So when people go to one of the sort of modernizing states and they go, well, why the hell do I live in some communist backwater? They do move, which was a lot more difficult, shall we say, in China. But and so the country is going in the right direction, but do not be fooled. There are plenty of states that are full headbanging communists. And what I mean by that is, as in socialist, old style communists, not arts or modern, progressive, capitalist communist style. And, GDP in some places is over $7,000. In some places, it's in single digits. And that is something to look at. As you say, I just think it's a big blob that hangs over the economy, and I'm not sure how you do get rid of something like that.
Right. Well, look, it's definitely a place with a lot of nuances, but tremendous growth, particularly in certain segments of society. Some companies that are fantastic companies, valuations that are, not where we'd like them yet, but in certain cases palatable. And I'm really excited about it, and I know you are as well. So
So I think what's interesting and different about India is the dispersion that's so very different to Vietnam. So Vietnam, you've got this sort of everything, technology, education, population, wealth, sort of clusters reasonably around the average. Whereas in India, you've just got those extremes. You've got unbelievably well-educated, super smart people doing cutting-edge biotechnology, people who've probably never even ridden a bicycle in their life. And when we look at the companies, there's some really cool, cutting-edge, modern services businesses, and there are some state-owned donkeys.
yeah, yeah. Well, look, I'm really excited to start putting these names in our book alongside our Vietnam names, and this will be a great journey. So thanks for joining me and talking about this for our audience, Rob, and we'll be back here in a couple weeks.
Thank you, too. All the best.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Asia Podcast by Muddy Waters. If you like this episode or want to dig deeper into Muddy Waters' New World Order fun, head to muddywatersasia.com or follow us at Muddy Waters Asia for more. Don't forget to like and subscribe.